Hello, welcome. It's such a pleasure to welcome you all here. So many of you here. If you were expecting that, as usual, Dean Markham would be welcoming you here to Convocation, I can promise you that about up until an hour ago, so was I. He's suddenly come down with a minor health issue, but fully expects to join you all tomorrow. And also teaches class tonight, so just a heads up for students. He fully expects to teach his class tonight. My name is Melody Knowles. I'm the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, and again, it's my pleasure to stand in for Dean Markham tonight. I remember my first VTS convocation back in 2013, and I was didn't quite know how this would all work, but I thought it would be my duty to welcome alums back to campus. And about 20 seconds later, after thinking that, I realized actually it's the alums who come back to campus, but in some ways welcome the people who are present into this endeavor called VTS. Alums are here for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but it's really you that hold the legacy of this place. And it's the honor of the faculty and administrators and staff to honor you by continuing this tradition and doing our best by you. So welcome back, but we know that it's you guys who own the place. My other duty and pleasure tonight is to introduce our guest speaker. Tonight's speaker is an American political commentator, columnist, author, and former attorney. He currently writes for the New York Times and serves as a distinguished visiting professor of public policy at Lipscomb University, where he's leaving tonight to go. He will teach an evening class tomorrow night. Previously, he was a senior editor at The Dispatch, a staff writer for National Review, and a fellow at the National Review Institute, where he became known for his reasoned and principled voice within American public discourse. A graduate of Lipscomb University and Harvard Law School, our guest speaker has dedicated much of his career to defending religious liberty and constitutional rights. He serves as a major in the U.S. Army Reserve, earning the Bronze Star during Operation Iraqi Freedom. A prolific author, his works, including Divided We Fall, invite readers to consider the challenges and hopes of civic life in an era of polarization. Now, just as a heads up, before you all go to evening prayer at 5:15, we hope that we'll have some time for question and answers. And the method will be this. Cards will circulate around the room to those who are present, to those who are online, and a special welcome to you all, too. To those who are online, we welcome you to write comments. You can submit your questions in the comments section, and we're going to bundle them together and then take them as much as we have time for and address them to our speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in welcoming Mr. David French. Thank you. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Is this on? Is this working? Okay. Thank you so much for your welcome. I was just saying it's a kind of a gray, cloudy day, but I love days like this. I have spent so much time in the South growing up that I have this theory that you react strongly against the extreme weather characteristics of your upbringing. So I'm tired of 95 and 80% of humidity. So I'm good with this. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm going to start by essentially paraphrasing a great American philosopher by the name of Homer Simpson. And if you are a follower of The Simpsons, especially early Simpsons, you may remember one of Homer's great declarations about life in the world, where he declared, "Alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of the world's problems." And in thinking about and talking about faith in the age of Donald Trump, I have a very similar formulation, and it is religion, the cause of and the solution to what is ailing the United States of America right now. So I'm going to break it down into cause of. This is going to be the most simple structure ever. We're going to break it down into cause of and solution to about this present moment. How is religion How has religion, in particular Christianity, become a cause of American problems, American division? And so to talk about it, we have to talk about what is actually happening right now. And anybody who's going to sit here and say, when we have a very complicated world, a very complicated culture, we're a nation of 330 million people roughly, continent-sized nation, almost impossibly diverse by historical standards. So this place is complicated, and so if anybody comes to you and says, I have a simple explanation for anything, part of your brain should sort of tune out, because you know they're not telling you the full story. So I'm not going to pretend to come in here and tell you the full story of what's happening and go on. I'm going to tell you an important aspect of the story. And one very, very, very important aspect of the American story right now is the centrality of hatred. The centrality of hatred between red and blue in this country is a fundamental reality of our current situation. Now, you might think, okay, hatred, I understand hatred now. We're very, very particularly polarized in this moment. But this has been building for a while. Let's go back to the year 2014. So in the year 2014, Pew Research Center researched the ideas and attitudes that Americans had about each other. So they asked Republicans, what do you think of Democrats? And Democrats, what do you think of Republicans? And in 2014, okay, that's very key, this is a year before Trump comes down the escalator in June of 2015. In 2014, 82% of Republicans, when surveyed, said they either strongly dislike Democrats or somewhat dislike Democrats. 82%. So the favorability rating for Democrats in Republicans' eyes was 18%. That's a low favorability rating. Democrats, as befitting their reputation as the more tolerant party, only 79% of them either strongly disliked or somewhat disliked Republicans. So you have a situation where by 2014 already the dominant characteristic of American politics was something called negative polarization. And so what is negative polarization? Negative polarization is when you are a member of your party or your faction or your tribe more because you hate or fear the opponent than because you love or respect or uphold the values of your party. And the problem with negative polarization is that what it means is that by its very nature, it's just constantly pitting you against your neighbor. It's a constant process of opposition. Because if you are negatively polarized, how do you determine what you believe? You determine what you believe by the opposite of what your neighbor believes. That's how you determine it. There was an interesting interview that my colleague Ezra Klein did a week or two ago with Ben Shapiro, the popular podcaster from the Daily Wire. And Ben said something I thought that was very honest and transparent. And he said the American right is no longer conservative. It is anti-left. Okay, so it is not conservative. And by that it means the traditional elements of kind of Reagan conservatism that had dominated sort of Republican ideology for many years. And this was a three-legged stool of limited government, strong national defense with an emphasis on international alliances, and social conservatism. Each one of those legs is much shakier now. Donald Trump is not a limited government conservative by any definition of that. He does not believe in strong international alliances. And then social conservatism, a lot of people think as Donald Trump as, because he appointed justices who overturned Roe, that he's a social conservative of some kind. That would be a no. He is not a social conservative. In fact, the Republican Party platform was the most watered down platform on abortion in 2024 that had been since the Ford administration and Ford's run for president in 1976. And so you're looking at a situation where in many ways the Republican Party had departed from conservatism, but without fracturing its core base and its core identity. Why? Because the core base and the core identity moved to anti-left. So whatever the left is for, I'm against. And you begin to see some of this also process working with Democrats. If you are somebody who's sort of stayed in one place and one position ideologically, it can be a dizzying moment. Because I'm suddenly surrounded by a lot of Democrats who really like free trade and NATO. And thinking, wait, what's happening here? But you begin to realize that when you are adopting a position that is fundamentally oppositional, and is fundamentally oppositional, then conflict becomes, rather than compromise, becomes the salient characteristic of political engagement. It is all about conflict. Compromise becomes an anathema, because if you're motivated by hatred of the other side, if you're motivated by fear of the other side, how can you then turn around and say to your constituents, you know these people that I have told you are fascists or communists? Well, they have some good education ideas. That doesn't land with people, right? That does not land with people. So right now we're in a position of utter anger in American life between partisans. This anger is overwhelming. Do you think it's gotten worse since 2014 or better? Much worse, to the point where a Republican and a Democrat, they have incredibly similar views of each other. They view each other as hateful. They view each other as ignorant. They view each other as brainwashed. They view each other as bigoted in remarkably similar percentages. Remarkably similar percentages. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about how this happened. How did this happen? Well, there's a few concepts, and I'm going to throw some terms at you. And if you remember nothing that I say, just remember a couple of these terms because they're going to really help you understand the world that we live in. Okay, let's start with term number one. Term number one is the big sort. Okay, the big sort. So what is the big sort? The big sort, it refers to a book dating back to the late 90s, early 2000s. It's this recognition that Americans are living amongst with like-minded neighbors more than we ever have in the past. In other words, where you used to move around the country, you'd move around for economic reasons. There's jobs out west, or I work for IBM, and I don't know if you guys remember how IBM was a juggernaut 25, 30 years ago, and they're just constantly moving people all around the country. Or maybe I've been in the military and I'm moving every 3 years. That there's been this sort of tradition of economic migrants. But then now we have ideological migrants, people who will move to a place where they feel more comfortable politically. Now we just moved up to Chicago over the summer, but I come from rural Tennessee, very, very, very conservative. And I can always spot who moved here from California because they have a bumper sticker. And the bumper sticker says, "Don't California my Tennessee." And I'm like, what do you mean your Tennessee? You just got here. It's not I'm a very YIMBY person, all the more the merrier, but just give it a moment before you say my Tennessee, right? And so people are moving to be around people of like mind, to such an extent where about every 4 years we set a new record of the percentage of voters who live in what are called landslide counties. So what is a landslide county? A landslide county is a county where one side wins by a presidential race by 20 points or more. That's a landslide county. I came out of a landslide county, and I came out of I'm going to mix my metaphors, a tsunami neighborhood in a landslide county, which that's even more than landslide, okay? We've got a flood and a landslide. So my neighborhood was 85% voted for Trump, 85%. So, okay, you might think, well, that's an interesting fact. What does that, how does that play with anything that you've said about hostility and anger? Because I can see a lot of reasons why people would want to live around people of like mind. It's just easier, right? You don't feel like you're constantly having to justify yourself, especially in a hyper-political age where the first thing that people often want to do is ask you about politics in very uncomfortable ways. I was playing pickleball the other day. Yes, I play pickleball, okay. Former tennis player, now pickleball. You can make the transition, okay, with your head held high. And I'm playing at a facility in Nashville, and you meet people, it's a lot of fun. And I was talking to this guy, and he said, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a writer, and I also teach. Where do you teach? Lipscomb. And he said, what do you teach? I teach constitutional law. Are you a conservative? Are you MAGA? Are you liberal? Are you a Democrat? What are you? That's not the normal social answer. I mean, the normal social question. But then I said, well, I consider myself an independent conservative. And then the next question was, well, tell me what you think about Charlie Kirk. So you're just diving deeper and deeper and deeper into politics immediately. And so if that's the environment, if that's where people are, you can imagine why it feels better if you're in agreement with everyone. It's easier. But there's something else that happens to us when we get in a community of like minds. So term number one, the big sort, which leads to term number two, the law of group polarization, okay? This one's important. What is the law of group polarization? The law of group polarization says that when people of like mind gather, they tend to become more extreme, okay? So you're already, if you're mapping this out in your head, if we're living around people of like mind, what is happening? We're becoming more extreme, all right? So this is something that makes total sense if you think about it. Let's suppose a group of you get together after there's been a terrible incident, a terrible shooting in America, another mass shooting, and there's about 6 of you, and you get together and you're brainstorming gun control ideas. At the end of that meeting, you're going to be more committed to gun control than when you started. Because there's nobody in that group who's raising objections. You're doubling down, you're doubling down. And so what happens is, if it deliberates long enough, if it's a like-minded group, if it deliberates long enough, then the entire group will become more extreme than the most extreme individual was at the start of the deliberation. It's called a cascade. And so what happens is people of like mind get together and they reinforce each other's worldviews to the point where they become more extreme, and here's the key, they don't even know it, that they're becoming more extreme because they're mainstream in their community. And so what does this mean? What this means is that we are clustering in like-minded communities, and as we cluster in like-minded communities, we're becoming more committed to our ideology or more committed to our hatred of the other side, if that's the root of our political engagement, and negative partisanship. And so you're just getting entrenched to the point where it used to be that if you were going to describe American politics, you'd have the bell curve, right? The big middle and then the small edges. It's flattening out. It's flat. The middle isn't so big anymore, and the edges aren't so small anymore, to the point where it's now a real dilemma for a candidate, because it used to be the case that you would kind of run to one side in a primary, and then you would run to the middle in the general election because that's where all the voters were. Not so much anymore. If you run to one side and then tack to the middle, you can lose enough people on the edge that you now are no longer viable. And so what has happened is that politics has become less a matter of persuasion and more a matter of mobilization. How big is my tribe, and how much of my tribe can I get to the polls, as opposed to how much can I grow my tribe through reason, persuasion, etc. Because the very act often of persuasion, believe it or not, is seen as a weakness. Because persuasion requires what? Often courtesy, decency, civility, engagement, conversation. But if it's the hated other side, then all of that is not fighting. That doesn't look like fighting. And so you have the big sort, you have the law of group polarization, and then you have our third term, nut picking. Now this one, I love this term, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it, all right? So a lot of our hatred and anger for each other is rooted in an endless stream of communication that reinforces how bad the opposition is. Just an endless stream. And you're in your algorithm, you're on your social media, or you're watching your cable news, and what is being fed to you In this world of negative polarization, the thing that just triggers that dopamine hit almost more than anything else is proving to you how bad the enemy is. That anything that can prove to you and cause you to double down on your conviction that however imperfect we are on my team, they're the worst. They're the absolute worst. That's where nut picking comes in. And what is that? What nut picking is when people on social media or elsewhere will find an extreme version of the other side, maybe the worst version of the other side, and put them out and say, that's what they're all like, okay? The extreme version of that we saw after Charlie Kirk's horrible assassination. A man shot him. Best evidence is he worked alone. We have no evidence that he worked with anybody else. A human being shot and killed, murdered another human being. Horrible, horrible, all on its own terms. But then you began to hear this rhetoric. They tried to assassinate Trump. They killed Charlie Kirk. And you're wait, hold on. Who's the they? Who's the they here? Because I think it's a person did that. Who's the they? And this is what happens is you begin to take the worst elements of the other side and you advance them as emblematic. That's what they are like. Let's use a more benign example that's not related. Well, this one's related to death also, but not related to assassination. So you have to, we're grading on a curve here. Barbara Bush dies of natural causes years ago. And she was one of the few people in Washington that was almost universally loved. Nobody in the world is universally loved except for Dolly Parton. But nobody other than Dolly is universally loved. But overwhelming, like on Twitter, on social media, Republicans and Democrats alike were paying tribute to Barbara Bush. And so, but there was this one professor, I can't remember if she was at Fresno State or Cal Poly, I just remember it was out in California, who wrote a very rude post, sort of dancing on Barbara Bush's grave. It was very rude, inexcusable. And all of a sudden, for about 72 hours, she becomes the most famous professor in America. Why? Because that's what they're really like, right? Oh, all these nice comments about Barbara, that's just the smoke screen. The mask is off here with this person. And you begin to see the nut picking, which is pulling people out, pulling the most extreme, the worst voices out, publicizing them, and then casting that as the whole. So there are accounts on social media that are entirely built around this. Like there's an account called Libs of TikTok. And some of you may have heard of this, but it's an account that goes and trolls all the way through TikTok to find, it might be an extremist second grade teacher in Portland, and will try to make that person famous as the face of the left. And then you have some similar accounts on the left, like said, there's one called Patriot Takes, which these can be almost kind of funny guilt follows because they do highlight some pretty wild people sometimes, but then you realize they're ripping this country apart because what they're doing is they're taking extremists and putting them out as emblematic and inflaming everybody. What's the end result of this? So not only do we hate each other, but we're literally wrong about each other. So here's what the data also shows, that Democrats and Republicans are wrong about each other. Democrats and Republicans both make the same mistake about each other. They believe the other side is more extreme than it really is. And so if they're going to mark out the political positions a Democrat would say about a Republican would say about a Democrat, they're just going to be wrong. Very wrong. They're going to believe their opponents are far more extremists than they really are, which begins to show you why people get so angry. I think I'm constantly dealing with extremists. Now, the interesting thing is, the more media you consume, the more wrong you are about your opponents. Okay, why would that be? Why would that be? Well, because we're siloing ourselves into partisan media. And how does partisan media make its dollars? It makes its dollars by reinforcing your partisanship. The only news outlets that did not increase ignorance and that actually decreased ignorance, this is going to shock y'all, the three big nightly newscasts, ABC, NBC, CBS. And I was talking to somebody senior at NBC not long ago, and I was sharing that statistic, and they said, oh, it makes total sense to us. We constantly emphasize that we're trying to provide news for the whole country, not whether it's in Manhattan or Des Moines or everywhere in between. They want to provide news for the whole country. And she also said something interesting. We tend to end our broadcasts on an uplifting note. With somebody from around the country. They could be a red, they could be blue in their political affiliation, but we try to end on this encouraging note. And so the major network news was the only news that created understanding. Fascinating. Now, who were the people who were the most knowledgeable about their political opponents? The people who consumed no news at all, because they got their information from their political opponents through these antiquated things called friendships. And so if they actually know a human being in the real world, they're more likely to understand them more fully than if they see them through a Twitter profile or through a Facebook profile. And so we're in this situation where the combination of the big sword, the law of group polarization, nut picking, is creating and inflaming an entire culture against each other. Okay, so now you'll notice I've not mentioned religion at all yet. The reason is, so far, everything that I'm talking about, religion has not been a firewall against it. It's been an enabler of it. Okay? One of the great tragedies of the moment is that in a time of hatred and a time of division, you would think, if you've read the New Testament, that the community that right now would be seeing its time in the sun as a countercultural example of love would be the Christian community. Because the Christian community is taught to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute. What are the fruits of the Spirit? Kindness, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control, or trolling, dunking? No, none of that, none of that. And so if you're a member of a faith that is so countercultural that it says to gain your life, you have to lose your life, so countercultural that its Savior came at a time of intense political persecution, did not overthrow the Roman Empire, but instead was crucified by it, and then when raised from the dead, did not go on a vengeance killing spree, but instead appeared to just a few people and ascended back to heaven with the Roman Empire still intact. It's a very different kind of model of engagement. And so what has happened, however, is that a key part of the American Christian community has decided that the fate of the nation and the fate of the church is tied to their political, and this is the key word, power. Their political power. Okay, and so, therefore, if the fate of the nation, if the fate of the church is tied to your power, then what is one of the most fundamentally just and good and right things that you can do? It is to pursue power relentlessly. Pursue power relentlessly. And so we have gotten into a state of our country in which elements of the Christian community have decided that the fate of the nation is tied to the power of their church. The fate of the nation is tied to the power of their church. And if the power of their church fails, then the nation could fail. And so what this creates is a dynamic in which, for many, many, many people, anything that smacks of weakness, that smacks of kindness, that speaks to gentleness, that talks about humility, becomes a threat. Why is it seen as a threat? Because decency, kindness, humility are not the proven ways to win at politics. They're not the proven ways to win at politics. Several years ago, or not, 2 years ago, my friends Russell Moore, former head of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and my friend, former InterVarsity executive and pastor Curtis Chang, we created a curriculum called the After Party. And that's a very clever name. It's for Christian political engagement. My wife thought of the name. She thought of it as, wait, it's got a double meaning, that after partisanship, after the political party, but then also speaking to sort of the ultimate wedding feast of the Lamb, the after party, when all is made right. Okay, wonderful name, great double meaning, a little better than my name. My name was going to be the Post-Partisan Christian Project. That doesn't exactly sing, right? That doesn't exactly sing. But one of the things that our central messages was that if you're going to look at the New Testament, you're actually not going to see a lot of public policy there. The New Testament is not going to tell you which countries to ally with. It's not going to tell you your tax rate. It's not going to tell you the amount of immigration you should have. It's not going to tell you what kind of monetary policy. It's definitely got not much to say about crypto. There's not a lot in the New Testament that's really policy-oriented. That's not to say that it doesn't have policy implications. It's just that policy prescriptions are not easy to find in Scripture. But what is easy to find in Scripture? What is easy to find? Command after command after command about how we love our neighbors. Command after command after command about treating each other with kindness and respect. New Testament, Old Testament, we centered our curriculum around Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? Now, I don't know about you all, but I remember the E.F. Hutton commercials from years ago. You have to be like Gen X and older, I think, to remember this. But this was when a stockbroker named E.F. Hutton, and there was this, you would be in a crowded restaurant, and somebody would say, my broker is E.F. Hutton. And E.F. Hutton says, and at that point, the whole room grows quiet in the commercial, and everyone's leaning in. It's a very effective commercial. I remember it 40 years later. But that's what I think whenever I read a scripture that says, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? I'm going to lean into that one, right? And it was to act justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before the Lord your God. 3 obligations, not one of them optional. So for the sake of being the nicest person in the room or not rocking the boat, you can choose to be, you don't have an option to not pursue justice. There are a lot of very nice people in the South who didn't want to rock the boat, and as a result, they didn't do anything about Jim Crow, right? So you don't have an option. You don't have an option of not pursuing justice. At the same time, you don't have an option of cruelty. You must act justly, love kindness. Many translations say love mercy. And then the final thing is you have no option of arrogance. You have to walk humbly. Now let me ask you this. Do those three virtues characterize Christian political engagement in the United States right now? Absolutely not. Now there are certain Christian organizations and people that I can say yes, 100% yes. But coming from my own tradition of evangelicalism, that is not how it is characterized. It is not. It is aggression. It is will to power. And when we were walking through this we're walking through this curriculum, even with pastors who were generally pretty aligned with the idea, otherwise they wouldn't have been curious about it, again and again and again, we got this objection. Well, what if it doesn't work? What if it doesn't work? There isn't an asterisk. There's no asterisk, okay? Micah 6:8 is not act justly, love kindness, walk humbly, unless you lose a presidential election, or might. Galatians 5, when it talks about the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit, there is no asterisk connected to the works of the flesh. It says, don't do this unless cruelty and aggression are necessary in politics to win. And then when it talks about the fruit of the Spirit, kindness, peace, patience, gentleness, it doesn't say this is mandatory until politics, because politics ain't beanbag. That's not the way Scripture works. And so when we brought this to the attention and we're making this case, again and again and again, we got the same objection. What if we lose? What if we lose? The problem, however, with that is if you look at Scripture, and if you look at, by the way, also the most successful Christian social movement in the United States, this is not exclusively Christian, but most successful Christian social movement in the modern history of America, both the example of Jesus and the example of the civil rights movement completely rebuke the political culture of American activist, Trumpist Christianity. And how do they do that? How do they do that? Well, number one, the example of Jesus, it's very clear. He came, I was talking at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary recently, one of the big Baptist seminaries, and someone asked me, what is your book that you're reading in these times to help you get through this moment? And I said, I'm going to give you the most stereotypically evangelical answer ever. It's the Bible. I said, but specifically, I'm reading the New Testament knowing that every syllable of the New Testament is written to a Christian community experiencing persecution we cannot fathom in this country. We cannot fathom what they went through. And yet we're walking around, especially, white evangelicals, most powerful faction of the most powerful political party in the most powerful country in the world, going at 6 minutes to midnight, if we don't win the next presidential election, all is over for us, all is lost. Just an absurd kind of degree of fear, just an absurd degree of fear. But we look at this situation and we say, in the New Testament, they were facing oppression we cannot fathom, and the answer was love your enemies. We face oppression we cannot fathom, including violent oppression, and they say kindness, peace, patience, gentleness. They say, Christ doesn't say, I took up the cross so you don't have to. He says, I took up the cross and you will take up your cross. And yet that economy, that political economy, which is so alien to sort of the way our flesh wants to exert ourselves, and it's so alien to our will to power, that did not come down, that was not given to us at a time of peace and prosperity for Christians and people of faith. It was given to us at a time of oppression. And for us to act as if we are now in a place where all of the New Testament doesn't matter, and the New Testament admonitions about how to treat your fellow human being don't matter because we're in an urgent political moment, completely false. And how do we know that's false in this American tradition? We know that's false in this American tradition because let's look at the civil rights movement and the philosophy of nonviolence. You will go, no one could ever say in a million years that Martin Luther King and all those who marched with him were not absolutely committed to justice. They were absolutely committed to justice to the point of laying their lives on the line for justice. But at the same time, they were absolutely committed to mercy and kindness. And at the same time, they absolutely demonstrated humility. It's fascinating. If you look at some of the pledge cards that if you were going to participate in some of the protests, say in Birmingham or Selma, there's these list of characteristics that King is wanting the people in the civil rights movement to exhibit. And one of them was, we seek justice and reconciliation, not victory. Wait, what? Wait, what? Because our modern thinking is, well, victory is what's necessary for justice and reconciliation. But that if victory is necessary for justice and reconciliation, what's our focus? It then is on victory. It becomes on the will to power. But what King was saying was, no, keep your eye on the main thing, and the main thing is justice. And every one of us in this room can work towards justice, even if we don't possess power. But if we take power as the prerequisite for justice, then what do we end up doing? We start working for power. And so, religion, the cause of, yes, what we are seeing right now is a situation in which countless Americans are saying, my religious point of view is under such threat, and my dependence on politics is so great to address that threat that the ends will justify the means. That the ends will justify the means. And those means that we are choosing, are ripping this nation to shreds, ripping families to shreds, ripping friendships to shreds, ripping it all to shreds, because the moment and the time and the era is just too important for weak values like kindness, weak values like gentleness. Now is the time of the fighter. And that message is ripping us apart as a country. So what is the solution? What is the solution? I'm reminded of, I'm actually reminded of George Washington's favorite verse. George Washington's favorite Bible verse was Micah 4:4. And it was that every man shall live under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. He wrote that almost 50 times in his private correspondence, in his letters to people. Most famously in the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island, where here you have this persecuted Jewish minority. Anti-Semitism is not new. It's called an ancient hatred for a very good reason. And they reach out to the new president of a new republic to ask, where do we fit in? Where do we fit in? And he writes this beautiful letter. Now, we know that Washington had a pretty selective view of everyone who should be sitting under their own vine and fig tree, right? He still had slaves. But that declaration of purpose, put into motion political change in the United States, put into motion change in the United States to expand and be a greater inclusiveness in our national community. And so when I look at what is the object of Christian political engagement, what are the means and what are the ends? This is how I think of it. The end is every man shall live under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And how do we do that? How do we do that? By acting justly, by loving kindness, and walking humbly. That is the approach. We have an end in our view, but the means matter as well. And sometimes the means can matter even more than the ends, because the means can destroy your ends. The way in which you pursue it can destroy the good values that you are seeking to pursue. And so that is the model. That is the process. It is seeking justice, loving kindness, walking humbly, so that every man shall live under his own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. One other thing about this. It is difficult to overemphasize how important human relationships are in all of this. We have this ability, and we have demonstrated an ability in politics to be thoroughly dehumanizing in a way that we often are not in the rest of our lives. Think about it like this. Let's suppose you are a Christian businessman, and you are wanting to bring your Christian values to your workplace. You're not going to think, well, that just means making as much money as I can. That's what it means to be a Christian businessman. Make as much money as I can. No, nobody thinks that. If they're thinking holistically about it, they think, well, I want to be a good colleague. I want to be honest and deal with my customers fairly. I want to treat my subordinates with respect. I want to treat my superiors and treat them with respect as well. I want to model what it means to be Jesus, the best as I understand what it means to be Jesus in this environment, which is about a lot more than just bottom line making money. Or if you're a student, a Christian student, you don't say, well, the way I'm going to be a Christian student is just getting the best possible grades that I can. No, you want to do well, but you're also going to be interacting with your neighbors in a particular way. You're going to be interacting with your professors, with your students, your fellow. When I was a young Christian law student, yeah, I wanted to do well, but I also wanted to exhibit Christ-like virtues with my friends, with my peers, with my classmates. But for some reason, we get it into politics, where we say our virtue is, what is your virtue? Well, I win. I win in policy. I win on electoral races. That's what my virtue is. My virtue is my victory. My virtue are my policies. That's what my virtue is. And that whatever we need to do to get to that virtue is just necessary. Think about how cramped, think about how outside of the rest of Christian experience that is. To sort of say, in all of these other areas, being a Christian involves holistically treating people with loving kindness. But in politics, it means beating you. That's what it means, because I'm so clearly right on the issues that my love is my victory. How convenient. How convenient. Think about that in business. My love is my wealth. Think about it in academics. My love is my scholarly my credentials. No. Your love is not your victory. Your love is manifested in how you treat other human beings created in the image of God. That's what your love is. And that doesn't mean your policies are not important. But the humility section of Micah 6:8 tells us that we may not know everything, that our ideas about what works as policy could be wrong. It might actually be okay if we lose. Or even if we win, we may not implement it well. That we could be wrong. We could be wrong. The final thing that I'll leave you with is I'm often asked in this environment, as I talk about all of these, what is it that we can do? What can we actually do to change our situation here in this country? And a lot of times what people are looking for is sort of like a 5-point plan. What's the 5-point policy plan that can change this country? And I've got my own ideas. I'm a constitutional lawyer. Here's one of mine. I think one thing that'll help turn down the temperature is if we pass a constitutional amendment to make it easier to amend the Constitution, so that we're not at each other's throats constantly with this Constitution that feels immovable, and then everything depends on the Supreme Court. No, let's make things a little bit easier to amend the Constitution. Here's another plan that I've got. It's called Get Rid of the Freaking Pardon Power from being unlimited, okay? So right now we have a situation where an unscrupulous president can run basically a grifting crypto scheme from the White House. That could never happen. And then pardon himself and all participants on the way outside the door. Just eliminating the rule of law for members of the federal government under an unscrupulous president. That's a scary reality that we could be facing. It's a very scary reality. Here's another one. Term limits for Supreme Court justices, so that every president gets 2 picks. They serve 18 years. We normalize this. It's not a matter of luck or of the draw as to who gets more picks and who doesn't. De-escalates the Supreme Court fight. So everything I've told you, I've got plans upon plans upon plans. All right? Just talk to me. I got plans. But here's the thing. None of it will work until we can heal some breaches between human beings. So what does that mean? I think one of the most concrete things that we can do to heal this country is to love a person who is different from ourselves, to enter into relationships and friendships with people who are different from ourselves. And this is, and I promise you, this is a tonic to our national soul if we can execute this. Because one of the problems that is driving extremism is loneliness. It's alienization. There's this phenomenal report done by the National Immigration Council and a group called Over Zero called the Belonging Index. And it looks at what do Americans feel a sense of belonging in their home, in their community, in their workplace. And what they found is 2/3 of Americans feel a sense of non-belonging. 2/3 of Americans don't feel like they belong in one or more of these crucial institutions. What they also found is that if you don't feel like you belong, and the people who feel this loneliness and alienization are often drawn to more extreme political movements, because that's where they find community. One of the best things that the Dispatch wrote before I left for the Times was by my colleague Andrew Egger, and he followed the front row Joes. That's what the people who are on the front row of all the Trump rallies, they call themselves front row Joes. So he sort of embedded himself in the front row Joes, and he followed them around, and they follow Trump like the people used to follow the Grateful Dead. Like they're just always there, right? And what he found was they came for Trump initially, and they stayed for each other. They formed relationships, they formed friendships, they walked through cancer diagnoses together. In some cases, people got married and divorced, and they walked through all of life together. And so to sort of say, well, you know, hey, you're wrong for supporting Trump, here's this fact check. You can't fact check people out of their community. You can't fact check people out of their relationships. And so how is it that we're going to heal this moment? Relationships are a key way. Did you know 1/4 of all men in America who either have a high school diploma or less report having 0 close friends? 0. I have a friend who had a business in Franklin, Tennessee, and he said many years ago he began to notice that the families of his workers were more and more fractured. And he started a policy where he said, if you don't have anywhere to be on Thanksgiving, come to my house. If you have nowhere to go, come to my house. And it first started with 1 or 2 visitors, and now it's so many he has to rent out restaurants because his workforce is that alone. It's that alone. So let me end with this. one thing that we can do. Here's one action item in addition to all the plans, all the constitutional amendments. It's this. In November 22nd, 2007, I was in the back of a Chinook helicopter flying low and fast over the Iraqi countryside, getting ready to join the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment for almost a year-long deployment in Iraq. I joined the Army later in life because I felt convicted that I had supported the war, but I was a civilian, I wasn't fighting in it. And I just got a sense of conviction that I had to walk my talk. So I joined later in life. I was 37 in basic training, which is not the ideal time to go to basic training. Let's just say, like, there are no training montages of me, like Sylvester Stallone, the pull-ups, no, none of that. I eked my way through. I finished my Army legal education. I volunteered to go to Iraq, and I find myself in the back of a helicopter, feeling very lonely, feeling very scared, watching the tracer rounds from a distant firefight rising up in the sky. I was a reservist joining an active duty unit. Nobody wanted me. Anyone in here with military experience knows that the active duty does not love the reserves. They view them as weekend warriors. There was this moment where I was added late to the unit because one JAG officer couldn't come, so I'm added late. The regimental deputy commander calls my commanding officer and 2nd Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment to tell him he's getting the reserve lawyer. And I'm standing right there, and I can hear my future commander yelling at the deputy regimental commander, "I don't want him. I don't want him." I'm sitting there feeling very insecure. And you know how the regimental commander ended the conversation? He was like, "Paul," my commander was named Paul Calvert, "Paul, he went to effing Harvard." It's like, that doesn't help. That does not help. That's not endearing me to the troops, okay? But anyway, so I'm flying in, feeling very alone, very isolated. And I land, and there's a guy who comes up to me, Captain Leo Broadhead. Now, Captain Leo Broadhead could not be more different from me if you designed him in a lab, okay? So I'm white, evangelical, Republican. At the time, I was a Mitt Romney partisan. He, Mexican-American immigrant, Barack Obama supporter, way before it was cool to support Barack Obama. I was about to say I was a Romney supporter before that was cool, but that never got cool. So he is a Mexican-American immigrant, Barack Obama supporter, who is a former Catholic, former Mormon, current agnostic, who says that he worships the Hubble Space Telescope because it can see further than anybody. Which I then asked him recently, do you now worship the Webb's telescope because it can see further than the Hubble? But he does not change gods. And so we are very, very different. But from the very moment that I got there, he said, "Lawyer, you're bunking with me." And from that moment, he decided on his own, unilaterally, he was going to be my best friend. And it was the most important decision that anyone made in that whole year from my perspective. Because from the moment that I arrived, unilaterally, this guy who knew nothing about me said, "You're with me." He knew I was going to be alone. He knew I was going to be isolated. He said, "Not on my watch." And so over the course of that year, we had this rule where you really couldn't go anywhere by yourself. We were co-located with an Iraqi unit. There were a lot of what we called green on blue incidents where allies would shoot you. And so we were never alone. And so he decided, "Well, David, I'm going to go with you to chapel every week." So he was my battle buddy to church every week, my agnostic friend. And every week I went to church with him. And he did that for me, not because he had a desire to go to church, because he knew it mattered to me. And he wanted me to always be able to go. And I remember being so grateful for his friendship and his love and support for me the whole year. As we were flying home, while we were in Iraq, while the unit was in Iraq, Obama wins. And thanks to law school connections, I had friends in the Obama campaign. And so I got him, I used my connections, I got him prime tickets for the Obama inaugural. And that was my gift back to him for all that he did for me. And so on Inauguration Day, I'm texting him, "How's this going?" No answer, no answer, no answer. Finally, I get an email, and it's an email of a video. And it's George W. Bush's helicopter rising to leave the White House on Obama's inauguration day. And he so nicely sent me that video with him singing, na, 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 na. And I wouldn't want it any other way. I mean, friendship. But when I think of how much knowing Leo, my friend Leo, didn't just enrich my life, it enriched my understanding of people who supported Barack Obama. It enriched my understanding of why they felt so inspired by him. It helped me see the supporters of the presidential candidate I opposed in a completely new way, in a human way. And that allowed me to genuinely, on inauguration, on the night when Obama is giving the speech, I could feel genuinely happy for my friend Leo, because I knew what this meant and why. And so when I think about what is it that we can do, yeah. Figure out the best 5-point plan, sure. Advocate for my constitutional amendment campaign, absolutely. I've even got another one, it's a great one. The first sentence of Article 2 should no longer read, the executive power shall be invested in a president of the United States of America. It should be the executive power, or the power to execute laws passed by Congress is vested in a president. Talk to me later as to why that's so important, but yeah, have all the 5-point plans you want. But the bottom line is, what can we do to heal this country? Be a Leo. Be a Leo for somebody else. To find the isolated person, to find the vulnerable person, to find the person who is suffering in this moment, and be there for them and reach out to them. After Trump was elected, I said, I feel like there's a mandate of I have 2 mandates at once. Mandate number 1, tell the truth. We live in an age of lies, tell the truth. Mandate number 2, defend the vulnerable. Tell the truth, defend the vulnerable. How do we defend the vulnerable? How do we know? How do we even know who's vulnerable? How do we know how best to defend people? By knowing them, by reaching them as human beings in a real world. And so, how do we live in a world where every man shall live under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid? One of the ways that we live in that world is by being a Leo, by being somebody there lovingly and unconditionally to make sure that no one in this country is left alone or behind. Thank you, guys. I'll take questions.
Thank you very much. So there's sheets going around, is that correct? For more questions, so we'll gather them. But I've got one here, kind of a softball.
Okay.
So, you know.
You can do, they don't all have to be softball.
By the way, thanks for that great shout out from Micah tonight. It was a big Micah night.
Micah brings the thunder. He's good, yeah.
All right. So you're speaking here to a gathered audience, mostly of Episcopal priests, although there's some Presbyterians there too. People,
Love
okay?
it.
Oh, yes, okay.
The frozen chosen, fantastic. I was in the Presbyterian Church until I deviated from one of the orthodoxies, Trump. But anyway, probably different Presbyterian church. Yeah.
But these are people who, week after week, decade after decade, they gathered people from the various silos and asked them to like acknowledge God's love and to spread God's love in the world. So, what would you say to this particular audience? So, how for pastors navigating the divisions in their congregations, advice for preaching, pastoral care, or church gatherings?
Oh, well, so first thing I want to say to the assembled pastors and priests is just thank you. I feel as if, when I think about a priest, when I think of a pastor, I don't just think about somebody who has a public platform. I think of people who have the most meaningful private ministries. I will never forget the first time that was really brought home to me. I was, my wife, she's cancer-free now, thankfully, but years ago, before she actually had cancer, she had a breast cancer scare, and we were walking into the hospital for the biopsy, and our pastor shows up for this biopsy. And I was looking, I said, "Pastor, it's 5 a.m. Why are you here?" He said, "I'm your pastor." And that was all the answer. That was the answer. That was the answer. And I think about pastors and priests as the glue in so many ways of, you are the people on the front lines of ministering to those who have nobody else. So first, thank you for what you do. It's indispensable. Number two, the dynamic I have seen, and maybe this is different in your churches, but one of the dynamics that I have seen is that the virtue of any institution is really truly measured by how it treats the outgroup. That the scriptural principle when Jesus is talking about, you who are evil will give good gifts to your children, like you even people who are deeply imperfect, you'll take care of the people who love you and you love them and you're in the in-group. It's the out-group. It's how do we treat the out-group? And if I was going to define the thing that has been most hurtful for us and our family was at the instant in our evangelical community that we went from the in-group. I was a Republican religious liberty lawyer veteran. Like that's the Holy Trinity almost. Back in conservative evangelical world, I was a defender of, I was a culture warrior. I was a warrior, I mean a JAG officer, but I deployed. And I was in the right political party. The whole culture fit me like a glove. And in my blindness, I thought that I was loved for more than that. And so when I departed from the political orthodoxy, the kindness that not from my pastors, not from our closest friends, the kindness and the hospitality and the love and the joy that I experienced just disappeared. It was replaced by confrontations at communion. It was replaced by elders scolding me for not supporting Donald Trump. It was replaced by attacks on my daughter, my youngest daughter. It was replaced by, we got to a position where we couldn't even attend church and feel like we weren't going to face some sort of direct confrontation over politics. And it was especially true for my wife because sometimes I would go out of town, and for some reason when I was out of town, people would circle her and attack her over me. And sometimes it would get really rough. We had an elder come up to us and said, I don't understand why you don't support our president. And Nancy, my wife, let me just say, don't get an argument with her. But she said, well, I'm very curious, what was your position on Bill Clinton? And he said, I was absolutely against him. She said, because of Monica Lewinsky, and he, absolutely. And he said, well, what do you think about the many allegations of abuse directed at Donald Trump? And he said, he's an alley cat. And she said, in a very loving way, that seems hypocritical. At which point the response to me is, you need to get your wife under control. And this is a kind of dialogue, and so what I began to realize was that the dynamic was the hardcore people who were very, very MAGA were very abusive to the outgroup. And the big bulk of people who were not like that just were quiet. And they allowed it to happen. And so what I would say is if you're in a position of leadership in a church, if you're in a position of leadership in whatever your community is, look at the outgroup. How are they being treated? And if you're seeing that they're being treated negatively, if you're seeing that they're being treated terribly, there's a necessity of an intervention. A necessity of an intervention to reach out and love and care for that person. And why would we say that? Because Jesus, one of the most famous of all of the parables, is he would leave the 99 sheep to go get the one, and to go find the one who's been isolated, who's outside, who's wandered away, whatever. He would leave the 99 to go get the one. And we flip this, especially in evangelical culture. I know this is a problem in other communities as well, but here's what we do now, is the one wanders off, and the pastor doesn't go after them, the lawyer does. And the lawyer gives them a non-disclosure agreement and gives them a settlement and then says, don't mention a word to the other 99 because we want them feeling happy in the sheep pen. And that's the opposite. That's the opposite of the biblical model. So I would say one of the things that you can do as a leader, in whatever capacity you are, take the temperature of your organization by taking the temperature of how it treats the outgroup. And if the outgroup is being persecuted even by a minority, and the majority is complicit, you have your mission.
Thank you. And thank you for all of your questions. As it turns out, our time's a little tight, so we only have room for one question.
Oh,
and I
gosh.
hope you don't mind if we give it to Dean Markham, who's watching from online while preparing for his evening lecture tonight. Thank you, Dean Markham. So someone in the back is going to give us, all right, Karen, thank you. Could you relay Dean Markham's question?
Yes, Dean Markham said he's sorry that he's not present in the room, but he's greatly enjoyed this lecture. And his question is, given the big sort, the self-reinforcing cycle of viewpoint and nitpicking, are not the trends of antagonism inevitably going to continue? Do you see them changing?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I absolutely see them changing. I just don't know how much damage will be done before they change. That is my big concern. You know, my former colleague at National Review, Jim Garrity, has this great statement that he says that reality always gets a vote and reality wins. And the reality is we are right now in a moment of deep misery, political misery, that very few people actually like our environment. The fact of the matter is we have about 2/3 of Americans who are an exhausted majority. And what does that mean? It means that they don't believe they're heard. They wonder what happened to dialogue, and they wonder what happened to compromise. And this is probably a lot of y'all, all right? You're sitting there, why can't we have a conversation? Why can't we have dialogue? Why can't we have compromise? But the problem is when this exhausted majority tries to raise these values, they get shocked and attacked so much, so quickly, that I started with Homer Simpson, let me end with Homer Simpson. There is this delightful GIF of Homer Simpson, eyes wide, that you'll see online, backing into the shrubbery until the bush closes in on him and you can't see him anymore. That's the exhausted majority. They come out and they try to engage in politics. They try to show some kindness. They try to show some mercy. They try to show some love. They get attacked so viciously, they just back out, and they leave the public square to the worst voices. And so that dynamic is building and building and building, but it does lead to misery. It does lead to conflict and misery that is unsustainable. The only question is how much damage is going to be done before we snap back. There have been moments in history where we have snapped back relatively quickly. So if you think about 1974, Richard Nixon, the imperial presidency, you have some Republicans who go and tell him it's time, Mr. President, to leave. Man, that's how quaint that can occur. But they tell him it's time to go, and he goes. And you know, enormous corruption. If you don't remember the Nixon era, there was a lot of profound corruption then. A lot of extreme presidential aggression, corruption. And who's the next person that Americans elect? It is a Baptist Sunday school teacher. So we went from Richard Nixon to a Baptist Sunday school teacher. So we can snap back. And then the next Republican went from Richard Nixon, sort of dark and glowering, to a very optimistic and sunny, very different disposition, Ronald Reagan. So Americans can change. After you had 4 consecutive presidential elections with FDR, we pass a constitutional amendment to term limit president. We can change. The question is, how much pain do we have to endure? And the problem I have is I want Americans need to be less optimistic that we're just going to get through this, and more alarmed that that just doesn't happen naturally. It requires people and it requires courage. You know, one of the most meaningful things I did in the last year was I walked the battlefield at Gettysburg. 3 days, day 1, day 2, day 3, culminating in walking Pickett's charge, which is a very visceral way to sort of experience it. And what was so interesting to me, and I knew this, but when you're there, it just really strikes you how contingent the American experiment has been. If Joshua Chamberlain doesn't fix bayonets on day 2 of Gettysburg on Little Round Top, does America live? Maybe, maybe not, right? And so my concern is that we will take this view that we muddle through, that we get through, we find a way to get through, and a majority of Americans will just hang back and hang back and hang back and wait for things to get better while damage is done. Deep damage that may not be sustainable and survivable. And so the bottom line is, if we are going to get through this, and I think we will, I don't know we will, I think we will, But the I think we will depends on moral courage. It depends on people taking risks. It depends on people loving their neighbor. And if we can't do that, we will be lost. On that happy note, and I hate to end on something. Let me end on something better, all right? And let me end on something better, because here's where I have a lot of, I will say I'm short-term pessimistic, I'm long-term optimistic. And I will tell you why I'm long-term optimistic. I'm long-term optimistic because I believe in God, and God is a God of justice and love, okay? And I'm reminded of this moment, and I'm going to end with a nerd comment, in Return of the King, the third book of Lord of the Rings. Sam and Frodo are lost in Mordor, and all hope is lost. They're surrounded by orcs. They're surrounded by, they're in Mordor. And Sam, at the end of his rope, looks up, and he sees a star shining in the sky. The clouds parted for a minute. And he sees a star, and in the words of Tolkien that are so beautiful, he says that Sam realizes in that moment that the shadow is a small and passing thing. There is light and high beauty forever beyond the shadow's reach. And I would say that the people in this room are aware of and know that there is light and high beauty beyond the shadow's reach. And that we should live in confidence knowing that. And if you serve the light and high beauty, then there is no reason for despair, but there is lots of reason for resolve. Thank you all very much.
Just a reminder that there's evening prayer at 5:15 in the chapel, followed by the alumni dinners later tonight, and then programming tomorrow, including Bishop Buddy. We're so glad that you're here. Okay, so we'll see you on campus today and tomorrow. Thanks for coming.